1972, after a flood damages their home, a family is forced to migrate to a new residence, which they believe would provide a fresh start. However, it turns out to be a brand new hell, fueled by demonic attacks, terrible visions, and terrifying manifestations. This is the story of the Smurl family haunting in Pennsylvania and the horrible entity that lurked within its walls. Hurricane Agnes unleashed raging floods that devastated the houses of numerous people, including the Smurls. The family of six included Janet and Jack Smurl and their four small children Heather, Shannon, Karen, and Dawn. With their home demolished in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and feeling uprooted and tossed about like the surging waves that took their house, the Smurls decide to temporarily relocate to West Pittson, where Jack's parents currently reside. After explaining what was going on and spending some time with the couple, they were astonished and ultimately blessed when Jack's parents suggested an idea to them. They came across a historic duplex in West Pittson that was in need of some repairs. They could live on one side, and Jack, Janet, and the kids on the other. That way, they could keep an eye out for one another while simultaneously spending more time together. Not able or willing to say no, Jack and Janet gracefully accepted their offer. But all too soon, they were presented with a question. Was their blessing truly cursed? Jack's parents pay for them all to move into the new house, and they quickly find themselves relocated and living in the newly acquired duplex on Chase Street in West Pittston. Although the house would need some renovation, the neighborhood appeared to be pleasant and inviting, making it a wonderful area to raise a family. The family works together to paint, retool, and make other repairs. But in no time, the slightly run-down home felt new, colorful, and modern, making the Smurls feel more at ease and eager for the future. However, this would not remain indefinitely, for it appeared that every time they hammered a hammer, put a nail into a wall, or sprayed paint, they awoke something within the home itself, possibly something that had been dormant for quite some time. During this period, little instances of weirdness began to emerge, initially appearing to be harmless. Tools began to disappear, only to return hours later and in new locations. Old stains on the walls began to seep through the new layers of paint, and many appliances in their kitchen unexpectedly caught fire, although being disconnected. Along with these strange occurrences, the family began to notice foul scents that permeated the entire house like an ever-present floating cloud of rotten meat that lingered over them only to dissipate moments later. Despite these strange incidents, the family didn't think much of them. They were simply grateful to have a place to live. Jack and Janet continued to reconstruct their lives. Jack, fortunately, had since obtained a better job than the one he had previously held and was promoted at this time. He could even coach his daughter's softball team. The kids had moved to a new school and were doing well, and Janet had gotten pregnant with her fifth child, and Jack's parents were doing great as well. Unfortunately, all of this happiness would not last. Things started changing for the Smurls around the year of 1974. It started when Jack's mother, Mary Smurl, experienced a heart attack. This left the entire family battling to make ends meet, and whether it was due to the renovations or something else, something paranormal began to develop and make itself known. It began when Janet started to hear the voice of her mother-in-law, who had recently recovered from a heart attack and was carrying out everything she could to support her. She would hear her name chanted out by Mary and run to her rescue, providing her with anything and everything she could possibly require. But the unusual thing was that Mary would sometimes be incoherent, sleeping, or she wouldn't call for her at all. At first, she attributed this strange phenomenon to stress and dismissed it. However, Mary soon discovers her own oddness. She, too, would hear her name called as if it were Janet's spoken word. When confronted, Janet would have no idea what she was talking about. But that was not all. The stains that had previously been painted over and considered to be covered began to seep through once more, as did new stains, several of which appeared on the home's hardwood flooring. As the days passed, the oldest Smurl child began to feel the presence as well. She was frequently woken up in the dead of night, immobilized in panic, and unable to move. She would notice translucent beings standing over her or on the side of her bed, gazing and watching her. And while it wasn't limited to the midnight hour, the activity seemed to increase at night. When Jack was at work or away, Janet began to experience violent and horrific encounters with an entity she couldn't see. She began to be violated by an unseen force. These interactions left her feeling panicked, violated, and dirty. The family's misfortunes continued to deteriorate as they attempted to cope with what was happening to them. Additional appliances, including a television, caught fire, inflicting smoke and fire damage to the residents on multiple occasions. And despite the TV, the other appliances were left unplugged to save money, which adds to the mystery. Additionally, after the family had originally repaired the property, numerous newly installed water pipes began to leak, causing not just water damage to the house, but also adding to their financial troubles. The Smurls' bad luck persisted, and by 1977, the activity in the house had escalated tremendously. The family's radio started turning itself on and off, typically at odd hours, and nearly always while the family was attempting to sleep. The sinks in their bathrooms began to turn themselves on, pouring what little money they had left literally down the drain, and their toilets began to flush by themselves. Along with this activity, the sounds of footsteps began to be heard all throughout the house, and even on the insides of the walls. Drawers began to open and close by themselves, and coupled with these happenings was again the stench of rotting meat. However, the family began to characterize it as the dead scent, except that it did not dissipate as quickly as it had previously or in a specific region of the home. The fragrance would encompass the entire house and linger for minutes, if not hours. Up until this point, besides seeing things being moved dealing with the stains, pipes, and appliances, Jack hadn't been targeted, so to speak, by whatever paranormal force that was now fully awake within the Smurl residence. But one night, as he was attempting to sleep after a long day's work, his side of the sheets were pulled away from his body, and the sensation of numerous of hands grabbing him ensured that not only would he not be able to sleep that night due to sheer terror, but that his wife had possibly been telling the truth. Janet became pregnant shortly after moving into the house, and she gave birth to 2 baby girls, bringing the Smurl family to 6. Shortly after the twins arrived home, it appeared like whatever entity had been awakened was making itself evident. It became increasingly violent and vengeful, as if it were jealous or despised the living. One morning, while the majority of the kids were at school or sleeping, the rest of the adults were out. Janet was on her way to the kitchen to make herself a cup of freshly made coffee. As she turned the corner, her blood ran cold. A translucent dark figure with hollow eyes stood in the center of the kitchen. She was frozen in place when she saw it, as if she had blinked, and whatever monster it was had vanished. As time passed, Janet continued to hear her name shouted out, but no one else was present. Strangely, as it had at the beginning, the voices frequently sounded like her mother-in-law, Mary. Even when she double or triple checked to make sure she wasn't losing her mind, Mary was nowhere to be found. Janet really was alone. Other weird sounds were heard from the other side of the duplex at the same time. Couples argue and fight. Regrettably, this is something that happens to many of them. However, these fights were a different kind. Jack's parents started to hear yelling and screaming, sometimes items shattering and coming from the opposite side of the duplex where Jack and Janet lived. These conflicts got so severe that they began to worry about Janet and the children's safety, as well as the collapse of their marriage. One night, Jack's father couldn't take it anymore. He walked from their front door to the other side, and with the fight still raging, he threw the door open, only to be greeted with silence. The entire family was asleep. He merely left, perplexed by his discovery. However, the supposed fighting would continue. Shortly after the strange finding, Mary had an encounter that nearly caused another heart attack. One evening, while her husband was still at work, and she was alone on their side of the duplex, she began to hear her name muttered. It sounded like Janet, but it was right within earshot or several feet of where she had been. Weirded out, as the majority of us would be, She began to move towards the voice beckoning out to her, and that's when she spotted it. The same transparent figure that Janet had claimed to have seen just a short time previously was standing in her living room, a stain spreading beneath its feet, and its mouth was terrifyingly mirroring Janet's voice and calling out her name. Mary, frozen in horror and her heart racing, dashed to the front door and entered Jack and Janet's home, terrified. The conversations that followed this event, in particular, resulted in the majority of each person's experiences being shared with everyone. They would all realize that the force in their home was hostile. Shannon Smurl, who was 7 years old at the time, became the next victim. One day, as she walked casually from the kitchen and into the dining room, a large glass light fixture fell and hit her, slashing her and raising the alarm bells for the entire house. Again, it appeared that the paranormal entity or force despised life, and now was possibly trying to end it if the opportunity presented itself. Scared but short on funds, they were all appearing imprisoned in what was intended to be their fresh start, but was now becoming their new nightmare. Shannon would continue to have her own unusual experiences. Later, she would relate how she would frequently wake up to find herself hovering above her bed, physically levitating several feet above it. Some nights, while floating, she was hurled across the room and into a wall with such force that she felt she was going to be crushed. The peak of Shannon's attacks occurred one night when she awoke to find herself floating once more. Instead of being let down or banged into a nearby wall, her door was pushed open and she was flung down the steps. Her parents heard this happen and rushed towards the screams of their little girl to find her absolutely hysterical and in pain. Fortunately, she would be fine physically following this occurrence in particular. Alongside the intensified attacks on their daughter, Janet too would begin finding herself woken up in the middle of the night, floating in the air, and sometimes horrifically without control of her body. She would then also be assaulted. However, Jack wasn't always gone at this time. Frequently at this point, he would be home and sleeping beside her, but could never seem to wake up, as if he was being kept asleep or in a state of paralysis while the events took place. Along with these powerful and vile manifestations came activity that was downright creepy. Not a day went by without the family hearing scratching noises from within the walls or experiencing heavy, drawn-out breaths from behind them, feeling the exhale on their necks and making the hairs on their entire bodies spring up. Jack, after a long day at work, preferred to unwind and decompress by watching television in the living room. On occasion, he would fall asleep to whatever was on TV before eventually waking up and heading to bed. However, this night he found himself awake and coherent, but unable to move, as if he was paralyzed or locked in some sort of glue trap like an insect. Unable to break free, he gazed about the room, attempting to determine the source of his distress. It was here that he came face to face with the being, the demon, who appeared to be destroying their life. The thing grabbed him from behind and pushed him to the floor, repeatedly beating his head against the wooden flooring before disappearing. After this, Jack stopped watching television to unwind. In fact, no one was able to unwind. They were terrified of whatever was happening in the house, unable to afford to relocate between all of the adults and seemingly stuck between a rock and a hard place, afraid and unsure what to do. They began to seek assistance wherever they thought they could find it. It was now wintertime, and the family, aside from their regular tasks, spent the most of their time inside. They were watching TV one afternoon and came across an interview with Ed and Lorraine Warren, world-renowned paranormal researchers. Not being particularly spiritual and unsure where to turn, they decided to contact the couple and were shocked when they responded. After communicating with them for some time, the Warrens agreed to come to their home to meet with the Smurls and investigate, and within a week, they did exactly that. Following an initial encounter with the family, hearing their statements in person, and exploring the property, the Warrens concluded that it seemed genuine and worth investigating, and they began their usual process of bringing in their team for an extended period of time to document and mull over potential solutions for the family. After several months of the documenting team living with the family and experiencing strange activity themselves, such as furniture stacking on top of itself, along with several other previously mentioned happenings, such as the stains and attacks on individual members of the home. Lorraine finally comes to the conclusion, after having a vision within the house, that they were dealing with a total of 4 entities. One was of an elderly woman who she believed was not a threat to the family, but was being detained against her will within the house. One was a young woman who was furious, bitter, and extremely violent. The other was a man who suffered and died in the home. The final entity was that of a demonic presence, and this demon was not only adept at keeping the other 3 spirits under its control, but it also used them to strengthen itself and wreak havoc on the family, sowing dissension, anxiety, and fear. It could feed on everything and become stronger. After reaching this conclusion and gathering sufficient material, the Warrens consulted with Father McKenna, a Vatican-sanctioned exorcist who had previously dealt with them on over 50 unique cases, so he was no stranger to the demonic. However, after his presence and attempted exorcism, the activity escalated in violence and animosity, and for whatever reason, it was no longer attached to the residents, but rather to the family members. Jack began to experience horrific visions of the creature at work, as did his father, and alongside the continued paranormal activity taking place at their home, their daughter Karen fell seriously ill with a fever that the doctors couldn't diagnose at the time and nearly died. Several of the other girls were also visited by the horrific presence that night, as Janet also was and continued to be. The evil entity also began to physically attack the family more often, causing stinging scratches and cuts on their bodies at random times, as well as deep and bruising bite marks. Still trying to help the family rid themselves of this creature and fearing for the family's continued torment, the Warrens convinced the Smurls to allow a second exorcism to take place, and McKenna again would visit and conduct a second exorcism months later in the early spring. During this exorcism ritual, EVPs were recorded, which, when played back after the fact, would reveal multiple entities laughing at and berating them for their efforts. Ed Warren would also be choked during this visit and would be incapacitated for multiple days after. Unfortunately, the second exorcism also failed, leading to even more violent manifestations of evil. Trying to get away from it all for even just a few days, the family went on a camping trip to the mountains, but the evil presence would follow them there as well, tormenting them wherever they went, allowing for no rest, no decompression, and no peace. Upon returning to their home following this trip and getting even more desperate, they decided to reach out to a local TV show called People Are Talking to see if anyone could possibly help them. They did, however, remain anonymous during their interview, but this call for help, however, went unanswered, but the demons seemed to retaliate against them for it. Janet would be flung against the wall once more, and Jack would encounter something genuinely scary and unexpected. As he woke up in the early morning to get ready for work before the sun had come up and began to gather his things for his workday departure, he came down the stairs and was met by a rotting and horrifying creature. Standing in front of the door was a monstrous being whose head almost touched the ceiling. It resembled a horrible amalgamation of a man and a pig standing upright on 2 legs. It screeched and rushed towards him, but as he fell backwards onto the stairs, hurting his back, the creature stood over him face to face, snarling before it disappeared. This manifestation disturbed and rattled Jack to his core. The same morning, shortly after Jack had left for work, because, although terrified, he still had to provide for his family if they ever wanted to have a chance of escaping this hellscape of a home. Janet was woken up a short while later by a hand reaching up through her mattress and grabbing the back of her neck and pulling her towards it and choking her. After these events, horrific snarling noises like that of a pig could be heard coming from inside the walls. The time was now August of 1986, and the Smurls felt that the risk of ridicule did not outweigh the need for their story to reach a wider audience, so that somehow, somewhere someone could possibly help them be freed from this torment. They would soon be granted an interview with the Wilkes-Barre Sunday newspaper, but instead of someone reading and immediately coming to their aid, their home quickly became a tourist attraction instead, The press, skeptics, and curious onlookers alike began to visit the house and camp outside of it at all hours of the day and night, with some particularly weird people even coming up and staring into the home's windows themselves. Some of their neighbors who had seen and heard strange things coming from the small residence began to turn on them. They believed that the family was concocting some kind of a story to try and make money. Eventually, however, despite the torment inside and outside of the home, now that they were experiencing, the Smurls would be contacted by a medium by the name of Mary Alice Rinkman, who offered to meet with them. Upon meeting the family and walking through the home, it was also Mary's conviction that there were 4 entities within the house, 3 human spirits, and 1 who had never been human, thus corroborating the Warrens' beliefs about the situation as well. She would, however, take things a bit further. She identified the old woman by the name of Abigail, the murderous man, as Patrick, and the violent and ill-tempered spirit as Patrick's wife, and the 4th entity, of course, could not be identified by name, but was indeed a very powerful evil entity. The press coverage, despite the ridicule and the positive acquaintance of Mary, also had pushed the Scranton Catholic Diocese into action as well. They offered to take over the investigation. In the meantime, the Warrens had not given up on the family, but rather had reached out to several more priests and had arranged for a mass exorcism to be conducted with 4 priests taking part as well as multiple prayer groups. Alongside this now, Bishop McKenna came in for a 3rd and final time and conducted an exorcism on the house for the family. Fortunately, the ritual, at least for a time, seemed to work because following it, there were no disturbances for about 3 months. But as winter set in that year, just before Christmas of 1986, Jack would again see the creature that tormented him for all of those years. This time, however, it beckoned him to allow it to take over. But clutching a rosary in his pocket that had been gifted to him by the church, he prayed as hard as he could, and thankfully, this time the demon vanished, never to be seen again. However, the putrid smells and violent manifestations would return and continue day in and day out. Frustrated, hopeless, and exhausted, the Smurls by this point had finally saved enough to be able to leave the dreadful duplex on Chase Street, and decided they needed the closest thing to a fresh start as they could get. So when they finally did move, they moved to a completely new town, one where the ridicule would not find them. But like the terrible pattern shown before, the demon did not seem to be tied to the property, but rather the family. The activity started back up almost as soon as they had moved in and laid their heads to rest in their new home. It would take some time, but in 1988, the church finally sanctioned a 4th exorcism, but this time at their new residence, and this finally seemed to have given the family peace. It seems like renovations, particularly on older homes, can wake up dormant spirits or hauntings. Perhaps this is what happened to the Smurls. It's hard to tell if the assaults were one or multiple demonic entities, but if they did truly exist, how did they get in the home to begin with? As far as the initial activity, the seeping through of the stains, the sinks turning on, toilets flushing on their own, and leaky pipes, those initially could be written off as poor skill when the work was initially done. But it seemed like with this story, all of these things were working perfectly fine for months before they all of a sudden began to go wrong while costing the family money that they didn't have. And money at the time seemed to be their main issue as well as the paranormal. So perhaps the evil entity knew and exploited this to add to the misery it was feeding on. But truly, at the end of the day, the conclusion is yours to make. Was the Smurl haunting legitimate, or just another tale to gain attention and concocted for money? Let me know in the comments below. In 1991, they would eventually release a made-for-television movie about what they had experienced called The Haunted. All in all, I found this story intriguing and fascinating, and I truly hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new here, please don't forget to subscribe. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, and please leave me a comment and share this video. All these things help build the community and help new viewers find the channel.